Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 2, which looks at Foundations of Intercultural Communication. Throughout this chapter, we'll be looking at the three different worldviews or paradigms that are included in the Judith Martin and Thomas Nakayama textbook, Social Science View, Interpretive View, and Critical View. Each of these views of intercultural communication provide a different lens with which to look at issues of culture, which is one of the reasons why we use each of these three different paradigms. Throughout this lecture, we'll be going through each of these. We'll also be discussing cultural identity issues and intercultural communication from an article based on Mary Jane Collier's reading, which is in the Samovar, Porter, McDaniel, and Roy textbook. So, in terms of the three major worldviews or paradigms that we will be drawing from in this course, these are the first, which is the social science view, the second, which is the interpretive view, and the third, which is the critical view. Each of these different lenses provide a different way to look at cultural issues, so we'll be going through each of these one by one in this lecture. The social science view has its origins in the field of psychology, and the primary goal of social science research is to describe and predict behavior. So under this set of conditions, I can predict that a certain outcome will result, okay? So according to the social science view, reality is something that is external to the individual. It can be described through objective behaviors, right? Verbal, nonverbal communication, things like that. And reality is something that can be predicted based on my ability to describe what kinds of issues might lead to certain outcomes. The primary method of data gathering or research for people who use social science research is that of the survey or observation. So you might conduct online surveys, you might have a paper and pencil survey. Many of you maybe have completed these types of surveys in your tenure at the university. A lot of times people who do social science research also will observe people's nonverbal or verbal communication behaviors. So for example, if you have ever heard of those studies where people are brought into a lab, let's say there's a study looking at relational dynamics or relational communication. Gottman is a communication relationship expert who conducted many research studies on this idea of successful relationships. And what Gottman found in his study, where he brought thousands of couples into a lab, all right? And what he did in this study is he observed the way in which these couples would communicate with each other. He would observe how many types of negative communication statements people would make. He would observe nonverbal cues. He would observe things like affection and affect and emotional cues, things like that. So basically what he did was he brought people into the lab. He observed their communication behavior, and based on the types of cues that he saw taking place between couples in the lab, he was able to predict with almost 90% certainty which couples would stay together over time and which couples would end up splitting up, right? So this method of observation assumes that culture is something that influences communication. The method of analysis or method of data collection that I just described, that Gottman had used, bringing couples into the lab, that would be a type of observation research. And we could also look at this type of research through certain types of research projects, actually, that have been done by multiple cultural scholars in the past. And there are many people, many cultural scholars, who have sought to understand the way in which cultural values and attitudes may shape the way that certain populations accept disaster preparedness messages and whether they actually prepare for impending disasters at all. So when we think about this idea of people's attitudes, right, and their cultural values, and in the previous chapter, we've talked about how cultural values shape people's behaviors, right? So when I'm looking at things like cultural values and attitudes and how people might respond when they perceive that there is an impending natural or man-made disaster that is, going to be emerging, this is very much a issue related to people's worldview or cultural attitudes, right? So let's take two groups, for example. Let's take a group of people who, let's say, are Western, Euro-American, Caucasian, all right? And given the worldview of many people from this background, nature is seen as something that we control, right? Nature is seen as something that we use for our benefit. Nature is seen as something that we can harness and things like that. So if I'm from this background and I hear from, let's say, the radio, the Red Cross, the news stations, politicians, everybody is saying there's an impending disaster happening, you need to prepare in these ways. Maybe you need to get food stashed, maybe you need to go to higher ground, maybe you need to stay, inside if it's really hot outside, or if there's a blizzard, right? Stay, indoors, things like that. If I view the world in a way where I can control my fate, all right, then I'm going to take proactive steps to control my fate for the better, right? I'm going to do the things that these various entities, professional and business and political government agencies, are telling me to do so that I can stay safe. Now, in another situation, let's say that I'm from a cultural background, let's say, I don't know, Chinese American, Chinese from China mainland, or maybe Japanese, right? Or maybe certain Micronesian cultures, or other cultures like that, maybe Pacific Islander cultures. I might view nature and I might view natural disasters and I might view my own life in a way that is fatalistic. Well, what does that mean, fatalistic? Well, when cultures have a view that is fatalistic, what that means is basically they believe that it does not matter so much what they do to influence their life, but what matters is the will that the gods have for them. Okay? So what I do would have little effect on my eventual outcome, on my demise or my survival, if the gods, or if the higher power that I, identify with, does not have it in the greater plan that I should live. Does that make sense? So I know it's a little difficult to think about that perspective when, many of us enculturated in this more, worldview where we control nature, we can influence outcomes, things like that, right? But what the research has found with certain immigrant groups, especially newer immigrants in the United States, is that sometimes people do not respond proactively to disaster preparedness messages when they have very fatalistic values about life. And that is a worldview issue, okay? And we talked about worldviews in chapter 1, so hopefully that knowledge is readily accessible. If you did not listen to chapter 1, I strongly encourage you to go back and listen to that. I'm doing my best to make sure that these chapters are not terribly long so that it's something that you folks can get through every week. And so please make sure you do listen to that chapter if this idea of worldviews is foreign to you. But basically, from a social science view, we can look at the different types of advertisements or message campaigns, for example, that would appeal to marginalized populations such as immigrant groups from fatalistic cultures, and how to help people who are from those backgrounds protect themselves better when there is an impending disaster, right? So if I know, for example, that people from fatalistic cultures are not going to evacuate when there is a hurricane coming, or they are not going to evacuate when there's a tornado or a tsunami, in Hawaii we have tidal waves, right? So if I know that folks from these cultures are not going to listen to the public messages, then what that means is I need a different intervention to try to keep those people safe, okay? So this would be one research topic, if you will, that researchers have done a lot of studies on, looking at these issues. The interpretive view gives us a very different lens with which to view culture and communication. And the interpretive view was founded in the anthropological and the linguistics background. The view, or the goal of the interpretive view, is primarily to describe people's thoughts, ideas, impressions, and behavior. Reality is seen as something that is subjective or internal to the person. And typically the method of research that people use in this area would be doing field study. You might do participant observation. So field study would be like where you actually go and move into a community so that you can learn everything about how they do their cultural rituals. Sometimes people engage in interpretive research in communities that they already belong to. So that's obviously very easy in terms of getting access. But observation would be a type of interpretive research, or participant observation, where you actually go and join the community that you're working with and observe the communication behaviors that are playing out as you are a member of the community serving or, dedicating assistance in some way. So culture, in terms of the interpretive view, is viewed as something that is created and sustained through communication, all right? And it's important to note also that in terms of data gathering, you can also gather data and analyze it from an interpretive lens through interviews or focus groups, okay? So I have done several studies in my history as a researcher where I have conducted open-ended interviews with people, and I've asked them questions about issues related to culture, identity, meaning, communication, their place in the world, things like that. And those research topics were definitely analyzed from an interpretive view. So field study, participant observation, interviews, maybe focus groups, those would be ways that you could use interpretive research. And the idea of interpretive research as compared to social science research is really about making sense of the meaning and the stories and the sense making that people themselves assign to certain interactions in life. So in comparison to the social science perspective, which primarily is interested in describing objective, concrete behaviors that are external, okay? The interpretive view is much more interested in describing subjective, internal, sense-making, explanations, reasons, experiences, things like that the individual uses to make sense of their world. Okay, does that make sense? So a good way to think about this would be looking at your own identity. In a class like this, we are talking about lots of different topics which are probably going to bring up issues of identity for you, right? You're going to be thinking about your cultural identity. You're going to be thinking about, what types of cultural systems you occupy or you are members of. You're going to be thinking about things like, how did I learn about these cultures? How did I learn about which values or attitudes are the correct attitudes to have? How have I learned about behaviors, or which behaviors are considered to be socially acceptable or appropriate in these certain interactions? I might also think about my own identity in terms of national issues or my national identity. So many of us can probably think back to our childhood, and we can probably come up with 5 or 10 very concrete events in our life that have taught us something about what it means to be from the country that we're from, right? So for example, what does it mean to be an American? Well, in my history growing up in the United States, even though I was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in Hawaii, okay, we're still a part of America out there. But, being American had a lot to do with celebrating independence, the 4th of July, right? And what do you do on that day? Well, you have various types of games and events and patriotic songs, and you do things like eat pie and play games and have picnics and, blow off fireworks, right? As a way of celebrating the independence that was achieved, from the British as an American, right? So I might also think about other types of holidays or events that have informed my American identity, right? So things like maybe New Year's is an important part of identity. Maybe Christmas is an important part of my American identity as a, Judeo-Christian American, right? Maybe Christmas is something that really brings my community together, and people who maybe don't otherwise speak all year long, they get together on Christmas and they put their differences aside and They get together and create shared meaning together. Now, if I'm from another community, like maybe if I was from a Buddhist background, or maybe from a background based on Islam religion, I would have very different types of cultural symbols or cultural values and stories and experiences that informed my understanding of what culture I'm from, and that creates and sustains meaning as a member of that culture. So, one thing to think about with interpretive research would be your own identity, what kinds of experiences you've had that have shaped who you are, the way you see the world, and how do you personally make sense of your identity as an individual, as a person belonging to the culture groups that you occupy, and as a person belonging to the national identity or national citizenship that you have. How do you make sense of that? How do you create meaning with other people to reify those things? Okay, this is a very repetitive theme in interpretive research, and I think we can understand it just by looking at our own lives as a perfect example. The critical view allows us to look at culture from a different framework than the social science and the interpretive view. So the critical view has its foundations in several different types of academic disciplines. The goal of the critical view is ultimately to change behavior, and the reason for this is because the critical view operates on the assumption that society is based on various types of power struggles or power inequity between certain groups. And so from this perspective, there are certain groups in society, in any society that you may look at, in Germany, Japan, the USA, whatever, certain groups in any kind of society tend to have more power than other groups. And so operating from this framework, the critical view seeks to identify what power systems are at play, look at areas that could be improved in terms of people's overall quality of life, and ultimately to change the behavior that's problematic. So according to the critical view, reality is seen as something that's subjective, so it's within the individual, okay? It's material, so we can actually look at things in terms of physical structures or material items that will reflect things like culture, and reality is something that's changeable. So that idea of reality as something that's material is kind of hard to wrap your brain around, so I'm going to talk about that just for a second here. Remember back in lecture 1, I mentioned the fact that in the USA we have certain groups of people who are on the margins, who tend to occupy lower SES groups. They tend to, not have as much money as some of maybe the more middle class people. And as a result of these economic challenges that large amounts of people in the USA have, there are many groups of people, these are the people, right, who also tend to live in areas that are less money to live in, right? And these areas of town, for example, tend to be near freeways or near factories or things like that. So if we're going to look at something like a neighborhood, okay, let's say a neighborhood in Los Angeles that is near a freeway and near a factory, right, we can look at those kinds of material structures and the material organization of, let's say, a neighborhood of first-generation Mexican-American immigrants who are living, in an area of the city that is, very toxic, lots of, freeway fumes from cars, you got factory toxins, maybe you have high crime because maybe the police don't patrol that area very well because it's sort of a rough area, right? You can, according to the critical view, we could look at something like where someone's neighborhood is on a city grid and how much pollution is in that area as a type of material manifestation or a material indicator of inequity in society, right? So according to this perspective, the reality of things are changeable. Now, how changeable are certain situations like, folks that live in, areas that have higher, air pollution than others? Is that really something that you and I can change? No. Is it something that could be changed potentially if the right interests or right groups decided to get behind that cause, yes, it is something that could be changed or modified, probably, right? But it would take a good effort and a lot of people to get involved to change something like that. But that is a good example of how we can look at material structures or material things as a way to understand power. Another way to look at it, which is maybe a little more simplistic, would be, just think about when you go into any kind of major organization, right? The first person that you tend to talk to is usually someone who is a low status or lower status person, right, on the totem pole. So this would be like maybe the admin assistant or the secretary that's at the front, right? And then maybe the person who's in management might have an office, like down the hall, and maybe their office door is open because they want to keep an open door policy. Well, then when you start to get to the vice president or the president or the CEO, usually their office is, harder to get to. Maybe it's up a few floors. Maybe they get, an intercom buzz to let them know if people are coming. Maybe they have someone who's a gatekeeper that sits in front of their office that's, moderates or sort of, allows people to come in or not, right? So we can look at power structures as something that are able to be looked at materially by how space and objects and buildings and neighborhoods and things like that are organized. According to the critical view, culture is seen as a site of power struggles between dominant and non-dominant groups. I think I have, illustrated that fairly well with the example of low-income groups that have to live in polluted areas in cities, right? Things like that. But another way to think about it would be minority group members in certain corporations, and maybe looking at the glass ceiling and how certain minority groups or women have a very difficult time achieving promotions beyond a certain rank, largely attributed, to this glass ceiling, which is basically this invisible ceiling where certain people in certain less powerful groups tend to cap out at their ability to advance, right? So the critical view would look at things like the glass ceiling and how dominant and non-dominant groups in society tend to interact in that way. Another example of the critical view would be to look at things like discourse and how discourse is used in news articles or publicly posted comments or even like news article titles, right? And how certain groups are presented in a certain way based on their status in society. There are several different types of cultures, and when we think of culture, we want to think of culture broadly. So a lot of times when we discuss issues of interculturalism, multiculturalism, ethnicity, race, people tend to use many of those terms interchangeably, but it's important to be aware of the many different cultures that exist and also what the terms actually mean. So in terms of types of cultures, we can look at culture in terms of nationality, so people who share the history of living in the same nation, and a lot of times these types of national identities tend to include various value systems and behaviors that go along with those value systems. For instance, in the United States, many Americans tend to view themselves as a group that is based on language similarity, so using English as a similar communication code, the idea of democracy and political action. There's also this assumption that individual rights, freedom of speech, and individual goal setting is also something that is good. And so this national identity issue is important to be aware of, and sometimes national identity and ethnic identity are intermingled. So in the case of a place like Japan, for example, Japanese national identity and ethnic identity are the same, right? So most of the people living in Japan today are Japanese in terms of their ethnicity. However, they also share a similar Japanese national identity, right? One of the differences in the United States, however, is that we are a nation of immigrants. So what that means is that our national identity is based more on a shared culture system rather than a race or ethnic similarity. But being able to distinguish those is important. By the way, The difference between race and ethnicity is something that we do want to be aware of. And so when we think about race, race tends to be a categorization system that is oftentimes imposed by the government or political systems. Race tends to be considered more of a social category. And if you want to read a little bit more about that, the folks, Samovar, Porter, McDaniel, and Roy, they discuss this issue fairly extensively in the readings that you're assigned. So you can think about what they say about it. But in terms of racial identity and ethnic identity, the difference between race and ethnicity is namely one of labels, right? So when we think of race groups, most of us know that there are about 4 or 5 race groups that are depicted or represented on the U.S. Census Bureau measurement system. So we tend to have the white Caucasian race group. We tend to have the African American race group. They also have a race group for Mexican American or Latino American. Hispanic is the category that they use in the Census Bureau right now. There's also a category for Pacific Islander, right? And of course Asians. And then there's another category as well. So those would be examples of types of racial categories. When we're thinking of ethnicity, however, we're thinking much more specifically in terms of the actual ancestral heritage that we have. So for example, my race category in the United States would be that of a Caucasian. However, my ethnic backgrounds include the Norwegian and German and Swedish ethnicity backgrounds. So hopefully that makes the difference between race and ethnicity very clear. I know that those terms tend to be used interchangeably. However, it's important for us as people who are studying this topic to be able to identify the differences between those terms and to use them correctly whenever we can. So ethnic identity, as I just pointed out, deals more with a shared ethnic ancestral heritage, okay? And culture, oftentimes there's a shared cultural background as well that goes along with ethnic similarities. We can also think of gender as a type of culture as well. Men and women tend to be socialized in different ways, and there's notions of what is considered to be feminine or masculine behavior. Also, we tend to see with gender that people oftentimes are acculturated to their gender in terms of what it means to be a good man or a good woman, or let's say a good husband or a good wife. Your book goes into various other details. But we are all socialized into these categories, into these group memberships. And we, from the day that we are born, we are taking in messages from other people and forming our own conclusions as well about the way that we should be. So gender is definitely something that we can consider its own unique type of culture. We can also look at something like profession, or what type of line of work you're in, or career track you're on, or the industry that you work in as a type of culture. People who tend to work in, let's say, the finance industry tend to have a certain type of value system, or tend to have a certain approach to how they make sense of the world. They would see the world and the various social, political, economic events that are playing out through the lens of someone who is looking at things from a fiscal standpoint or a financial standpoint, okay? And so we can look at things like profession. The healthcare profession is another area to look at how there's a unique culture that operates in these different fields of practice. So in healthcare, most people tend to go into the helping profession, like doctors, nurses, aides, other folks like that. They tend to go into it because of a common desire to help other people out, to try to improve the world, or to help people improve a quality of life, right? So this might be a shared type of a cultural value. They may have a shared they probably do definitely have a shared educational background. There are certain modes of how we operate, standards, things like that. So we can think of profession as a type of culture unto itself as well. In addition, we can look at geographical area as a kind of culture. So many of you who are attending this university may be from bigger cities. Some of you, or many of you, may be from smaller farming towns. And also, you folks have come from different regions of the United States. Some of you are from other countries. And many of these geographical differences in terms of where we're from tend to influence the way that we view the world, things that we tend to assume are normal, or the way that things should be done. Definitely can be influenced by where we live and the kind of cultural makeup of the area in which we live. So geographical area is something to consider when we're thinking of culture. We can also look at things like organizations as a type of culture. I know that one of the things that makes an organization a desirable place to work, according to many stories that I've heard from colleagues or students or people I've known, and based on the research, what we know is that an organization or a company that has a very positive company culture tends to be the kind of place where people want to work. So what that means is that those companies and those organizations tend to be highly sought after in terms of people acquiring positions, working there. People tend to stay longer and do better work at organizations where there's a strong, happy company culture. Also, people tend to call in sick less. There also tends to be less turnover and things like that. So overall, organizations who are able to establish a positive, effective, working organizational culture tend to be able to recruit better talent, and they can hold on to the folks that they recruit longer as well, because people like working there. In addition, people tend to do better work when they're happy in their jobs. And so those of you who are listening to this lecture right now, many of you in the future will probably be in situations where you are in some kind of managerial or management position, supervising, maybe you're working with groups or teams, things like that. So it's important to think about how your communication as a professional shapes the culture in the organization where you work. So if you want to make sure that you establish a positive organizational culture, even within your work group, right? You certainly cannot control the overall or overarching corporate culture at the place you work, right? But you can control how you interact with the people around you, especially if you're in some kind of management position. So you want to be thinking about what kind of a communication climate or a communication environment are you establishing through your communication. There are multiple books that have been written on this topic. I don't really have the time to go into all of the details on organizational culture, but I guarantee you that if you want to know more about how to establish a positive organizational culture in the future, or maybe at a job that you're currently doing, there's lots of research and books that have been written on it. But basically, what you want to strive to do is to strive to create a positive environment that's encouraging and supportive, that has open communication where people feel that they can talk to you honestly about issues that they may be struggling with the job, or other types of climate issues. And when we say climate issues, we mean more the social aspect of what it's like working at the company or the organization. So if you're able to facilitate a positive, supportive environment that's open, then you will most likely or more likely be able to create a positive organizational culture, which tends to keep people happy, and you'll get a better output or outcome for your organization. And finally, it's important to think about ability and disability in terms of a different type of culture. A lot of times, people who have different abilities, sometimes I like to use the word differently abled instead of disabled, because it allows for people who have varying abilities to not be stigmatized with the labels that we use. So you can also substitute the word differently abled if you don't like the word disability. But I think it's important to acknowledge that, people that have different abilities tend to experience the world in very different ways than people who do not have a different type of competence or ability there. So there's the difference between a visual disability, okay? So one that is obviously something that people can see, right? Such as, let's say maybe you're in a wheelchair. That would be a very apparent disability, right? Which would, of course, influence many of your interactions on a day-to-day basis, right? And then there are disabilities that are invisible, or that are often not something that you can see. So this would include things like, attention deficit disorder might be considered a invisible type of disability, or maybe people that have some kind of like a test taking anxiety that's inhibiting for them, right, on a very severe level, or maybe people that are dealing with severe anxiety, depression, other types of cognitive things, like people who may be dealing with brain disorders, things like that. Those are invisible, right? So you have the distinction between the visual disability, or the visible disability, and then the invisible disability. But there's also a distinction between when people acquire the disability, right? So some people are born with different abilities. They are born never being able to see, for example, and so they never know the difference, right? It's not like they go through the first 10 years of their life and then they lose their sight. So in some ways, that could actually be easier for some people because they don't have to adjust to joining a different group in terms of having that disability. Other people may have perfect, typical, or, sort of the often, typically abled capabilities until they're in their 30s or 40s, and then they might acquire a disability, which obviously transitioning from a culture where you're typically abled, right, versus one where you're differently abled or disabled would be very hard. It's a difficult adjustment for people, right? So that's another distinction that we can think of in terms of ability and disability. And then there are the different types of abilities and disabilities. So you have people who may be dealing with mobility issues. You have people who might be dealing with vision or hearing, right? Those are other types of competency issues people struggle with. There might be things, like I said before, that are not visible, so cognitive issues, right? And so people who are struggling with mental issues or emotional problems, they might feel a particular type of stigma, right? Because in the USA, there tends to be, and not just the USA, in many places actually, there tends to be a stigma that's associated with mental health treatment, or needing counseling, or needing mental health services, things like that. So there may be different stigmas associated with things. Obviously, if you have a communication issue in terms of your ability or disability, that's going to impede your ability to connect with people. There'll be all sorts of challenges that you might face. So these are different types of cultures that it's important to be aware of, the fact that different types of disabilities might create different challenges and different areas of triumph for people, right? And also, it's just important to be open to learning about the different cultures. I remember when I was in California finishing up my grad program, I had some friends who were with the Center of Disability Access there. They had a group. And so I started going because I'm interested in issues related to inclusion and things like that. I was going to the meetings, and I remember learning early on something that was surprising to me. And I learned early on from some of my friends that were dealing with issues related to hearing that the deaf culture is not one culture in terms of the attitudes or views or practices that people have. And I think as someone who doesn't deal with a hearing challenge, it's easy for me to assume, well, everyone who has a problem hearing, or everyone who's deaf, maybe belongs to the same culture. Maybe they're in the same culture and they have the same attitudes. But what I discovered is that within and among the deaf culture, there are different subcultures. So for example, among some people, there is an attitude or practice that they should seek out any kind of assistive technology that is available in order to be able to hear, or to be able to operate in more of the dominant group style, right, with just normal speaking. Okay, for other people who are deaf, they actually prefer not using the ear implant, and they prefer using the American Sign Language communication style to interact, right? And in some of those groups, you have people who look at the other group with judgment. So I heard from some of my friends who deal with these issues in their life that sometimes the people who choose not to get the implants in the ears to help them hear better, sometimes the people that choose not to do that actually end up viewing the people who are choosing to use assistive technology in a negative way, like they are abandoning the group, or trying to be better than the group, or not, not staying with the authentic deaf culture by learning American Sign Language and just using that mode of communication. So that was really eye-opening for me to discover that even among people who on the surface have the same disability of being deaf, that there's such diversity within that group. So different types of cultures. I'm sure that you could even add a few other types of cultures onto this slide. You could add things like sports teams, I believe would be a very good example of a type of culture. You could add things like fraternities and sororities to different types of culture groups as well. You can certainly add religion. I think the reason that they haven't discussed it in your book here is just because they're assuming that that has something to do with ethnicity and stuff. But religion would definitely be another type of culture system where people can share commonalities, despite the fact that there might be more superficial differences like race. You may have the same religious background as someone, even though your race might be different. So that could allow people to connect on a deeper level because they share a similar religious background, even if their race groups were different. So there's lots of things to think about, and we're going to move into different cultural identity properties here in a second, where we look at the ways in which people learn how to make sense of the identities that they have for themselves and the identities that society attempts to place upon us in terms of who we should be. When thinking about issues of identity, one of the main ideas that we want to consider early on is the difference between avowed and ascribed identity. Avowed identity basically is the way that we see ourselves, the image and person that we put forth in the world, and the person that we want other people to see us as. On the other hand, ascribed identity deals with the identities that other people may place upon us or assume about us or expect about us or expect us to fulfill. And so we can think about things like ascribed identity, for example, as dealing with those kinds of situations where stereotypes are playing into the equation. So sometimes what happens is that we might meet people who belong to various groups that we have impressions about. And it may be that we have these impressions because we've had experience with a few people in that group, and maybe they haven't been positive. Or sometimes these impressions can come from the attitudes and statements of people who are close to us in life, our families and our friends, what they say and think about certain groups. And we also get ideas about certain groups based on what the media shows us and the media portrays. So we might find ourselves in situations where we meet people who belong to certain groups, and we might ascribe an identity onto them. And this happens typically when we don't have a lot of experience with people belonging to that particular group. And so we might have certain expectations about who they are, what they believe, the way that they will behave under certain conditions, things like that. And it's something that can really hinder our ability to effectively relate with people. And it may also cause us to avoid interacting with certain types of people just because the impression we have is negative. So we may want to avoid interactions to try to keep things easy, not have to deal with challenges or difficulties, conflict avoidance. A lot of people just don't want to put themselves in situations where they feel that they will be uncomfortable. And this is actually a very understandable human trait, and I can relate to it. I'm sure many of you can relate to that as well. On the other hand, we might also find that other people are ascribing identities to us. So perhaps you have been on the receiving end of being labeled, or people assumed that you would do certain things because of the group memberships that you belong to. Perhaps people have told you that you should be doing certain things because of what groups you belong to. These are all examples of ascribed identity, and it's challenging to manage the avowed and ascribed identity process. It's something that people are probably dealing with throughout most of their life, I would guess. And I know that I have dealt with these issues in various ways. And if you think about your own life, I think that you can probably come up with situations in your own experience where you have not really felt like people saw you for who you are or who you want to be or who you see yourself as. So I think this is something for us to really think about, because the ability to cultivate empathy is really useful and can be a very powerful tool in helping us to develop the motivation to want to improve our communication and the way that we relate to others. We can also think about culture in terms of core symbols and expression. So core symbols are basically ideas or objects or institutions, if you will, that tell us about our place in society, our place in the world, things like that. They are basically expressions of cultural beliefs about how we should live our lives. And so, sometimes these symbols can be things like beliefs. Sometimes they might be types of expression, such as the freedom of speech or certain types of speech, or maybe things like dress or different ways that you decorate your body. We talked about things like piercings and also tattoos as a way of decorating the body, makeup, the ways that people do their hair. You can think about things like plastic surgery and modifying body types or body forms to try to adapt to a certain expectation or culture of beauty, or what people think is beautiful, right? So this acculturated idea of standard beauty by which people try to adapt to fit that. So these are all core symbols that tend to occupy the cultural experience. Sometimes these types of symbols are things that people may struggle with. Sometimes people tend to feel like certain core symbols should only be used by certain groups. So there's issues of entitlement and appropriation that can play into this, in terms of, well, this is a cultural expression that belongs to my culture, but yet other people are using that practice, and they're not really a part of my culture. It can get complicated. But I think that the main thing to think about is that symbols are a huge part of our experience as human beings, and we tend to use symbolism much more than we probably realize. And it also influences the way that we view other people and, of course, the way that we view ourselves. So related to symbols are the labels we use. And labels are basically just categories of symbols that we agree upon that refer to certain types of groups of people in the world or socially. And so we can think about things like the changing meaning of different labels, such as American. Your book is using an example of how the term American may be perceived as something that evokes, a sense of patriotism and in-group identity among people who live in America. But the same term may not provoke the same happy response, let's say, from people living in other places who have negative impressions, negative stereotypes of what Americans are like, right? So basically, anytime you have assumptions about what those people are like, chances are there is information that's not being included, right? Especially when you're grouping huge groups of people, many, many people, based on a few attributes or a few characterizations or a few assumptions, okay? So we want to think about that. And I think that, when you read something like this in the label section of our book, and, they talk about negative sentiment that people, let's say, in Central America and Canada may have about the term American, right? When you experience that in a book like this and you read about it, it certainly allows you, as those of you that are Americans, okay, it certainly allows you to see how it feels to have something negative ascribed to a group that you belong to, and I find myself just, looking at this example and using it in this lecture, thinking to myself, well, why do they think that? And we're not like that, and so nobody wants to be put in a situation like that. And so I think that it's actually kind of interesting that that's the example that your authors chose to use here. So labels are important, and we want to be careful about the kinds of labels that we use and also the kind of language that we use, especially when we are communicating in public. A classroom environment, a business environment, any kind of political dialogue, obviously public writing, or things even on the web like Facebook, email. These are all things that we want to think about in terms of the language we use. And generally speaking, we want to use language and labels when we interact with other people that are non-offensive, non-degrading, non-inflammatory. That is the professional standard, and that is something that we all need to be conscious of. Sometimes we might make a mistake, and that is perfectly human to do so. I've certainly done that myself. And, if you find yourself in that situation where you say something and you realize, it was something that maybe you shouldn't have said, it's very easy just to correct it. And you can just say, oh, excuse me, or I apologize, that, that was a poor choice of words, and then move on, and just don't do it again. So I think these are, if we're going to talk about labels in a class like this, where we're really thinking about creating an environment of respect and mutual respect, basically, right? We can be different, but we have to be able to acknowledge those differences and be okay with it and work with everyone's differences in a diplomatic way so that everyone feels heard and included and things like that. Okay, that's the professional standard, and that's something that we want to strive for as professionals in a globalizing world. Identity forms, I'm going to briefly touch on. Let's see. Excuse me a second. Oh, identity forms deals with the difference between individual, relational, and more collective or community norms and relationships. And so basically, people tend to adapt the way that they communicate based on who they're communicating with. That's kind of an interesting aspect of various identities. And so the main thing to think about in this section on identity forms is basically that people tend to have different types of experiences based on personal identity, or how do I, let's say, dress myself, okay, versus how do I communicate in a social environment with my group or with people that I know and like, right? So those are various manifestations of the way that we go about experiencing culture and expressing culture through communication, okay? And as anything in life, it's important to be aware of the fact that cultures stay the same, and that means that they're enduring, but cultures also do change over time. So for example, research has shown that among new immigrants to the USA, that the first generation, okay, so the generation that immigrates, typically tends to speak the language of the mother country, okay? Typically by the second generation, the children of these people, okay, the second generation, they tend to have about a 50% functional rate. Okay, some of them speak the language maybe fully, some of them probably don't speak it hardly at all, and then there's others that have a little bit because they grew up around the language, so they understand what it means because they grew up hearing it being spoken in the home, but they also grew up going to school where English was always used, right? So they have a somewhat competence in the mother tongue, and then usually by the third or fourth generation, the language tends to not be spoken anymore, the mother tongue language or the national language. So that's an interesting example for the way that cultures are enduring, but also changing. So you have the fact that the culture itself probably still celebrates many rituals and types of celebrations together and types of maybe religious or cultural expressions through music or, other types of communal experiences. Those are the enduring aspects of culture, but the language aspect of culture is definitely something that assimilates people. And so when we say that we're looking at the changing nature of culture, when people do not speak the language of their original ethnic or cultural background, their identity also changes, right? Because languages are very cultural, and the language is not just a way of speaking, but the language is also a lens for viewing the world, right? So we have lenses that help us to view the world, and language does that. And so anyway, it's definitely a changing part of the culture, and people's views of themselves in the world change when people don't speak the language anymore. So that's a good example of how language tends to be enduring and changing. And I think that the last thing I'm going to talk about in this chapter, and you can read through content relationship and also salience and intensity differences, but I'm primarily interested in the labels that I'm talking about on this slide, okay? But the affect, cognition, and behavior are basically three manifestations of the way that we experience the world through culture. So affect deals with the ways in which our culture and the challenges that we might face as a result of being a part of that group help us or contribute to the emotional experiences we have, right? How we feel about our life, perhaps how we feel about other people, how we feel about the world and our place in it. We can also look at the cognition or the thought process, the psychology, the ways that people see the world, the impressions people have, okay, and how those impressions of the world shape their experiences. So that's something definitely to think about. And of course, the other component is the behavior. So ultimately, what is the effect or what is the impact of affect or emotion, and then cognition, which is psychology, right? And how does that affect people's behavior out in the world when they relate to other people, okay? So these are various cultural identity properties to be aware of. In the next section, we're going to go through the dialectics that are laid out in the Martin and Nakayama textbook. And those are interesting because they look at the ways in which individuals and collective systems interact to create meaning for shared culture. The first dialectic that we're going to talk about is the cultural individual dialectic. This dialectic addresses the fact that among most people, or among people belonging to the same culture, okay, usually, there tend to be things that are shared among these folks and things that each person does differently, okay? So on some level, we can say that when we look at women across certain types of cultures especially, so I'm going to say Chinese women, Chinese immigrant women, maybe in the USA. We're going to look at folks from some Middle Eastern cultures, some Latino cultures, okay? Women from these cultures and others, but I'm just giving a few examples, tend to have cultural gender values that tend to promote modesty and privacy, okay? And there are also cultural values that tend to promote respect for authority. So what this means then is that in a situation, let's say, where a woman is seeking health care, okay, and maybe she's from another country, she's in the USA, she has an issue, has to go to the doctor. She goes to the doctor and she's confronted with the situation where there is potentially a male physician who has been assigned to be her doctor. And perhaps she has these values, cultural values of modesty and privacy, where there's a cultural conflict for her at that point, right? Because she is really not able in her culture or wanting to, based on her background, go to a male doctor, especially for certain types of exams. In addition, there's that respect for authority issue, which can shape the willingness to confront or be upfront. So you have situations where people get into very complicated interactions and they have to make choices sometimes that don't enable them to have the best outcomes for their health care. So, on one level, we have similarities of cultural gender values, right, which can influence a group of women who have shared cultural values in their experiences in the new country that they've immigrated to. On the other hand, you also have the unique communication style of each person, right? So some people are introverted and some people are extroverted, very talkative. Others who are introverted tend to prefer to be less vocal. They tend to process things internally, okay? You also have the ways that people approach the world, their attitude differences, attitudinal approaches. You have things like people who are very upbeat and other people are more monotone in terms of their communication style, how they actually speak and articulate words. So, these are all different types of unique, idiosyncratic differences that influence the way in which people develop, how they express themselves, and also how people relate to each other in the world. The personal contextual dialectic deals with the interaction between the individual and their environment. And so what we know, for example, from the previous slide, is that people tend to have their own individual communication style and approaches. Some people are very verbal, they talk a lot, others don't. Some people are very affect related. They might be very touchy, like they like to pat people on the shoulder and give people hugs, things like that. And other people are not touchers. So everyone has their own individual communication style. However, at the same time, when we communicate, we are constantly adapting to the environment in which we're interacting. So, for example, many of you have interacted at your jobs or your place of employment. Also, you've been interacting here at the university probably for several years already. And what we know is that there are certain norms for how we conduct ourselves in professional interactions, right? We've talked about these a little bit in previous slides, so I'm not going to get into it too much, but I think we all know what we mean when we say professional conduct and professional communication behavior. So we are typically adapting our communication with the intention of being appropriate, right? Now, sometimes we're not even conscious that we are adapting our communication to meet the environment or to fit the environment, but most of us are doing it, whether we are aware of it or not, and some people are doing it with varying levels of effectiveness, I'd like to add, but that's all I'm going to say about that. And I think that the main thing is that we're trying our best and you're adapting as well as you can. And when you don't do it as well as you should, you address the situation, adapt, and you move on and incorporate it for the future, right? So looking at this idea of professional interactions and norms for professional interactions, we can think also about things like informal versus formal communication, right? Or communication contexts. So when we look at the professional interaction environment or the professional organization, we know, for example, that when there are meetings going on or classroom lectures or classroom interactions, or there are, board interactions, or maybe there's elections going on, or public speakers, things like that, we know that that's more of a formal communication environment, right? So we might be dressed a little more professionally. We might be, more careful to have our cell phones turned off or on vibrate so that we're not disruptive. We're going to try to minimize side conversations unless it's like a public arena or something, so that we're adapting and being respectful to whoever's speaking. There are lots of things that we're going to do to adapt to this formal environment. On the other hand, if we were going to be going to some kind of a company barbecue or happy hour or, meeting down at the beach for a cookout or something, and somebody showed up wearing the same clothing that they wear to work, like a collared shirt and, black slacks and dress shoes, right? Or something like that, that would be a severe violation of these informal norms, even though it was a professional interaction, right? So we can think about the interaction between the personal communication style and then, of course, the contextual restraints and expectations which guide our communication behavior in most situations. especially situations that are professional or public. The differences similarities dialectic deals with areas of difference or diversity and areas of commonality or similarities that we might face or experience when dealing with people from even the same culture, but also different cultures as well. So, for example, we see that people have different types of nonverbal communication styles. For instance, some people use their space or proxemic behavior in a certain way. Some people might prefer to have a little bit more space between them and other people when they're communicating in one-on-one conversations, right? People have certain needs for space. Some people don't like to be in, small spaces where they don't have a lot of options for moving, right? So everyone has a preference in terms of nonverbals and the space issue. But oculesic behavior is also important to consider, and that deals with things like eye behavior. We've talked about this briefly, but there are different nonverbal oculesic tendencies that can be grounded in cultural differences as well. So we want to be conscious of the fact that there are differences in terms of eye behavior, and when we encounter people who maybe violate an expectation or don't do something the way we expect, to be aware of the fact that this could be culturally based. Also, there's haptic or touch differences. So what is considered to be normal or appropriate in one culture is not considered to be appropriate in another culture. So, for example, one thing that I have heard about in terms of students I've had or people who work in corporate environments is that sometimes when men come to study at the university, or maybe they are going to take a job at a corporation, in this area in the USA somewhere or in this region, that they have very specific religious values, and one of those values deals with men and women touching, okay? So for some men from certain Middle Eastern cultures, there really isn't supposed to be any touching that takes place between men and women who are not relatives or related by marriage, okay? So what this can create is a potential conflict, cultural misunderstanding, maybe a discomfort or uncomfortable situation for someone who has a different type of a nonverbal preference in terms of touch. And so it's important to be aware of some of these differences. I've heard of situations where men from the Middle East, they meet someone who is a female, and the female sticks out her hand to shake hands. And so this is a very standard practice here in the USA that we shake hands when we meet. However, for that Middle Eastern man, that certain interaction has created potentially some conflict, right? Because that's really not something he's comfortable doing. So it's definitely something to be aware of. Differences will exist among people who belong to the same groups as us, but also there are differences between our group and people who belong to other groups, right? In addition, on the other hand, I should say, we also have the common human experience, which grounds us in a very foundational similarity because of our shared humanity, right? So every human will probably, okay, there are maybe a couple of types of disorders where people don't experience emotions that much or something, but typically humans tend to experience several things that they're shared. So the desire to be successful in life and to be happy in life, that's a shared human experience. The desire to find happiness rather than sadness, that's a shared human experience. To be able to see your family happy and to, try to leave the next generation a little bit better off than your generation was, right? That is a very common human experience among most people you talk to. So these are similarities that we can look to sometimes when we feel as if there are just so many differences. What we can focus on to help ground us in our commonalities are some of these human similarities. And sometimes it's good to look at those similarities and to remind ourselves of those things, especially when we find ourselves in situations that are challenging and that we would prefer not to be in, reminding ourselves of our common humanity, the fact that we're all basically doing the best we can with what we have and with the experiences that we've been given in life. And so, I think that reminding ourselves of this can be very useful, not just when dealing with people from other cultures, but when dealing with anyone, right? I think that these are things that we can all do well to remember. One thing that we know about culture is that it is both static and dynamic. What that means is that cultures tend to be consistent. There are aspects of culture that tend to remain the same over time. There are certain types of values that continue on for generations to come. And there are also aspects of culture that must change to adapt to the modern world. And so we can look at the static versus dynamic aspect of culture in this way. And it's interesting to think about it in terms of your own family history or your own ethnic cultural background, right? Most of us can trace our immigration to the United States. Those of us who are from the United States, many of us can trace that immigration process within the last, 5 or 6 generations. So a lot of us have some kind of knowledge of that. And this is why we have that assignment, by the way, where you folks are to talk to someone in your family who knows about your family history in terms of immigrating to the United States. So it's about allowing you to get back into touch or to learn something perhaps that you didn't know about your own culture. And it's important just to have some kind of knowledge of our culture as we move forward in a world where there tends to be more of a merging happening in terms of culture, where people are merging into more of a culture that deals with capitalism and that deals with commercialism, international globalization. These are many of the modern cultural themes that tend to be occupying the modern world, right? But in terms of our cultural history, that's something that is still there if we go and look for it oftentimes. And even if you don't have people that you can talk to about your cultural history, if you just know your ethnic backgrounds, there really is a lot of research that people can do about their history in terms of, what was happening around the time that your family immigrated, perhaps. What kinds of cultural celebrations or cultural dress or music or food or songs or things like that did your family or perhaps people in your ethnic group use to celebrate culture, right? So these are all things that we can look for in order to try to preserve a piece of authentic ethnic or cultural background, despite the fact that we live in a world that tends to have a merging happening of cultures, right? So we can also think about this consistent changing aspect of culture in terms of issues related to anti-immigrant sentiment, for example, in the United States. And also we see a lot of this happening globally now, especially with such increased migration from people all over the world to lots of different countries that tend to have jobs so that people can, have a better life, right? But we can look at this idea of anti-immigrant sentiment as something that in the United States history is something that has been present for much of the history of the country. Okay, so we can probably agree upon that. And what's interesting to think about is that although the idea or the sentiment of anti-immigrant sentiment is something that existed in the past, all right, the groups that are the object or that are the target of that sentiment tend to be different nowadays. So that's the static versus dynamic aspect when we look at something like immigrant sentiment, okay? So now, and it's interesting to even, acknowledge the fact that there is anti-immigrant sentiment in this country, especially given the fact that this is a country of immigrants, right? So I think it's something that, it's very interesting to me, and I think that this is an issue that people all over the world are dealing with because of globalization, and I know that you've heard that already several times from me, but you probably will hear it again because globalization really is the guiding force behind much of what's happening right now in the world. So in terms of the groups that were targeted, though, going back to the anti-immigrant sentiment, you see that the sentiment is something that is an attitudinal issue that has been a part of the history of our country, okay? For good or for bad, it is something that's been there, okay? And the groups, though, that used to be the targets are different. So we see in the past, they were groups like Italians, Irish, and even actually Germans as well. That's not something maybe that we hear that much about, but the Germans really dealt with a lot of, and also the Japanese during World War II, the Germans too, anti-immigrant sentiment with those groups as well. So, and I've heard stories from people who, would try to pass as non-German because they knew that people, were suspicious, things like that. It's all the normal human responses to what was going on at that time in history, right? So nowadays, though, we see that the target, more the attitudinal negative target, tends to be groups that are more Hispanic or Latino backgrounds and Middle Eastern backgrounds. So we can look at the static dynamic dialectic in this way. And it's important to just be attuned to the fact that cultures stay the same, but they also change and adapt based on the interactions that are happening within the culture, so within the community perhaps, or on a broader level, what's happening within the society, or we can even look at it from a political economic standpoint and what's happening, with that situation and how is that shaping the changes that people have to make to survive, right? And to adapt in a world that's changing very fast. The advantages and disadvantages dialectic addresses the fact that people often occupy group memberships that some of which give you advantages or privileges, and other group memberships which bestow upon you disadvantages or challenges. So we can look at various types of groups, and these types of group memberships tend to influence what types of advantages we enjoy in terms of social interactions or professional privileges or things like that. And we can think about the ways that these group memberships may give us challenges that we have to overcome, if you will. Sometimes they're based on other people's ideas about us, so dealing with stereotypes people may have. Sometimes they're dealing with other issues that we might deal with in terms of challenges related to disabilities or perhaps impressions that people develop about us based on our age. So some of the groups might deal with national origin or where are you from, okay? And how does this group membership in terms of where you're from influence people's impressions of you or influence advantages that you have, perhaps that other people who are not from the nation that you're from enjoy. We can also look at things like race. Do I belong to a racial group that tends to have more of a dominant presence in terms of how many people there are? So are there lots of people that look like me in my society? Does my race group tend to enjoy certain types of advantages in terms of I don't know, perhaps maybe positive stereotypes? That would be something to think about. Does my race serve as a benefit for me, or does my race serve as a disadvantage or a challenge for me in certain situations? Now, another thing to think about is how context specific some of these group memberships may be in terms of whether they give you advantages or disadvantages. So we can look at things like nation or national orientation, national affiliation. And within the USA, being an American is seen as a good thing, right? Especially being a patriotic American. That's something that, we tend to celebrate 4th of July. Patriotism is something that a lot of Americans probably identify with, right? But being an American in terms of traveling internationally may not always be something that bestows upon you advantages, right? In fact, in certain types of countries or certain countries where maybe we have a history with that country that's not positive or something like that, there may be disadvantages to belonging to that group membership. So many of these types of issues of advantage and disadvantage are very context specific, and I think it's important to be aware of that. But we can look at things like nation or race. We can also look at education and the privilege and advantages that education gives us in order to decide or pursue careers that are personally meaningful to you, that is something that most of the world will not be able to do, right? Most people will never get a college education. If you just look at it globally in terms of the numbers, most people across the world will not go get a formal education in order to establish themselves in a career that they find meaningful, where they can have a good quality of life, right? So just the ability to have an education and to pursue a career that's meaningful is a major advantage, right? Religion can also be something that's an advantage or a disadvantage depending on where you are, especially if you look at this issue in terms of the global interactions with religion. Okay, so religion in the USA, there tends to be more of a Judeo-Christian tradition. So that tends to bestow upon people who are Judeo-Christian religions more of an advantage, right? On the other hand, in other countries across the world, being a Christian might not be a good thing, okay, in terms of having advantages or disadvantages. But we can also look at things like socioeconomic status, or the amount of money that people make, what their level of education is, and also what they have in place in terms of social resources or people who can give them connections or open doors for them in terms of jobs and things like that, right? So what is the socioeconomic status of people? Is this something that is serving as an advantage to you, or has it been something that's been a challenge or a disadvantage, right? I know that the university has many students who are the first generation to go to college, and for many folks who are in their first generation in their family to go to college, this is a huge accomplishment, and a lot of folks have had to experience overcoming economic challenges growing up in order to be able to attend college even, right? So, there's something to be said for living the dream or achieving the dream, right? So, and that's actually one of the wonderful things about America is that, in America, if you go to school and you get an education and you establish yourself as a business person or a professional or whatever, you can live the life, right? And that's accessible through education in this country. And so, SES is something that is, it gives certain people a lot of advantages in terms of pursuing higher education, especially if you're from a group where people have been going to college for generations. But those of you who are in your first generation going to college, I think that, that's a really wonderful thing to be doing, not only for your generation, but also for the future generations, because that will become the new norm in your family, is that people go to college. And so, you're really acting in a leadership position there doing that. And those of you that have family members that have already gone to college, those of us that have experienced having the help of people who have been to college as we go through the educational experience, really have been very fortunate in having, like your parents to help you with your homework, or people who can hire tutors for you, things like that. So it's a good thing to think about in terms of SES and how it gives advantages and disadvantages. We can also think of things like age and how people get stereotyped or judged based on age and categorized, and how sometimes being young can be really a great thing, and other times being older can be a good thing, depending on what situation or context you're in, right? So if you're in the modeling or acting world, being young is fabulous because you're fresh and you look good and, things like that. But if you're in a business professional environment, maybe being in your 40s might work for you better because you might be taken more seriously by people because they think you have the experience to back up your claims or what you're trying to do, right? So age can be something that is interesting. And I think that the interesting thing about age is that if all of us are lucky, we will get the opportunity to go through the entire life spectrum, right? From birth to death. And so that's one aspect of our identity that is constantly going to be changing. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity there for us to really be mindful of, okay, well, how do I see myself in the next phase of my life? What do I want to achieve here? And what do I want to spend, my years on the planet achieving, and what values do I want to work for and serve while I'm living, So age is interesting, and gender obviously is something that tends to sometimes be an advantage for folks or a disadvantage. I think that gender can be one of those context specific issues as well. So, for example, in the healthcare profession, let's say with doctors, if you're looking at physicians and doctors, being a male may actually be a good thing. That might be an advantage because there are probably more male physicians still today than female physicians, right? Doctors, MDs, people like that. On the other hand, if you are a male who wants to go into nursing, right? And as we know, when we think of a nurse, who do we think of? We tend to think of women, right? So as we know, most of the folks that are going to nursing school are still women. So if you're a man who wants to become a nurse, you're dealing with some disadvantages in that situation with your sex, right? Being a male. So gender, sex. We're using it interchangeably here, but really for the purpose of identity, gender and sex are not the same thing. Sex is your actual physical body. So what is the physical equipment that you were born with, right? And gender is really a socialized construction of how we should behave usually it's based on what sex we belong to, okay? So just to clarify the difference there. Another type of advantage, disadvantage would be orientation and ability, right? So sexual orientation can typically, in most dominant intergroup interactions, sexual orientation that's not straight tends to be more of a disadvantage, right? And we can also look at things like disability or ability as a type of advantage or disadvantage. So if I was trying to, get around campus and I have to use a wheelchair, obviously my disability is a disadvantage, right? But if I'm at a conference or convention that deals with identity issues among people with disabilities, I probably would have more credibility in that situation because of my disability if I was talking about that issue, right? So context-specific issues are very important with considering advantages and disadvantages, and I encourage you each to think about which group memberships you occupy and how those group memberships give you certain advantages or certain challenges that you have to overcome in different situations or different communication interactions that you encounter in life. And what are the best ways that you can think of to navigate some of those challenges that you might face? The dialectic dealing with history and future is the last one we're going to talk about in this chapter. And this dialectic is interesting because it considers the historical events that have characterized the experiences of people in the past. We could think about our own ancestors, for example. And it also identifies the fact that there is a very constant present that you and I and the people in our families are living with regards to what it means to be who we are from our culture today in the modern world, right? What it means to try to preserve or maintain our culture despite the media and corporate sort of entities, right? So, these issues related to history and future are very important because, when we study things like the history of our ancestors or what kinds of things they did before they immigrated, what did they do for a living? What did they do for fun? What were the hobbies that your ancestors had, right? When we learn about these kinds of things, it's very interesting because we start to connect with who we are at the same time, right? So, for example, you might do some research about your ancestors or some people that came to the USA, and you might discover that one of your grandparents, let's say, was a professional musician, okay? Or perhaps it was your grandparent and then your auntie and your cousin also were professional musicians, okay? Maybe you find this information out. Well, wouldn't it be interesting if you were always somebody that loved music and you did choir stuff or you played an instrument, and here you find out that music is a really big part of your ancestral cultural identity, right? So that's a way that we can ground ourselves in the identity and history of people from the past, okay, and the different types of challenges they had, the different struggles that they faced, and in many cases, the struggles that they overcame through hard work and perseverance, right, and having hope and faith, okay? looking at the past is definitely important in remembering who we are and who we want to be, right? But at the same time, we want to be thinking about the future. And on a previous slide, I talked about how with people who are first generation to go to college, they are doing the future generations in their family a huge service, because by establishing getting a formal education as something that we do in our family, right? Which is what happens when people start going to college. You know, one person goes, and then another person goes, and then the next generation, maybe everyone goes, and and that's how education happens, right? In my family, my grandparents actually were, let's see, my grandfather was high school educated, and I think my grandmother only had a 6th or an 8th grade education. And so, my grandmother worked in a Motorola factory, and she did really well in terms of, developing these electronic devices. My grandfather worked at a factory as well. And then, in the next generation, my mom, she went to college, right? And so because she went to college, and because my dad had gone to college, I was basically someone who always expected to go to college. Okay, so that's the way that education tends to get passed down, is that it just becomes the new normal. So, looking at the present and the future, the decisions that I make today, or the decisions that you make today about how you're going to live your life and what types of values or priorities you're going to have, those types of decisions will definitely play a role and will influence the future generations that come after you, right? And we could talk about the ways in which the decisions we make today influence our future in multiple types of situations, okay? And we don't have to really time to do that in the scope of this class, but you can just think about this in terms of your own life and what values you want to promote and what types of things you want to make time for and prioritize, so that in the future you're passing on something that you feel good about, that you feel was a good use of your time on this planet, right? So anyway, this is the end of this chapter, chapter 2. Thank you for bearing with me. I know some of these slides were a little bit long. It got a little wordy, so I really appreciate it, those of you that were able to bear with me. And we're going to be moving on to chapter 3 next. Chapter 3 is very interesting, and I will talk to you all very soon. Thank you.